My name is Ashley. I'm here to talk about basically some principles that I'm applying in my work and have arrived at from being in the space since 2014. And basically, how do we support this emergence of ReFi as we're going in this direction? A clicker. Thanks. Oh, I should mention, so the talk's not about Resource, but just for some context, Resource is a decentralized protocol for people to issue credit to each other without needing upfront capital. We're open source and did a pilot in the US last year and are now starting to do some projects in emerging markets. All right, so in terms of how do we start here? So if we're going to talk about a framework, if we're going to talk about developing new principles, first we have to start to get honest with ourselves of how we're doing. So this is just a general question. How would you say crypto's doing in terms of living up to its potential in a general grade scale? F-. This is that crowd, yeah. Any other thoughts? B. You think a B? Yeah. Why is that? The potential, yeah. And I think, so then, okay, let's talk about what problems we say we're solving. And then I think it gets to that point. What you described is actually what I also believe. I think that the first wave of crypto was really about proving in the language of the world that is money, which is how people speak today, that these systems work, that they can replace systems. However, if we look at what we say we're actually doing, and these principles came out of a workshop that we did earlier this week. So it was a collaborative participatory workshop. In terms of all of these aspects of what we say that we're actually doing, I would say we're much closer to ideas rather than implementation, right? And a lot of people make these arguments that, well, it's really early days. I would argue it's because we don't have the right frameworks and principles in place, that we are continuing to do projects that are limiting what we actually, think is possible. So the point of this talk is to help start uncovering maybe why that is, and then help support us in going more in that direction. So in terms of these goals, just to talk about it a little bit, centralization leading to inequality, corruption, illegitimate data, broken systems with bad incentives, access to financial services, inclusion in financial services, all these different aspects that we like to talk about. I'll just say this again. We did this workshop earlier this week, and when we started with the abstract question, people were like, oh, about C minus for crypto. When we reframe it in terms of the actual values of the space, people were more on the F minus scale that our friend shared with us. All right, so 3 things that we can do to improve. One of this is a rebrand. So I think ReFi is showing how we can go in this direction. I don't think ReFi is the only type of rebrand we can do, but I think that it's pretty important because if you talk to people outside of the space, especially now, crypto has a bad name, and I think there's a lot of aspects of the space that we can understand, which are making it responsible for that. So I think actually celebrating and going in this different rebrand direction for whatever project you're working on is something to evaluate and consider, especially if you're going to start to kind of shift the principles and what you're working with and applying. Similarly, a framework. So that's what I'm going to go through today. And this framework is something that I'm crowdsourcing and working on in different workshops. So it's a constantly evolving process. And then finally, a change in our perspective and how we're approaching our work, which we'll talk a little bit about. So the ReFi rebrand, why is this important? So I think what ReFi does is it really simplifies what we say that we're doing here. It simplifies it to say that we have extractive economics. They're failing us. They're failing our natural ecosystems. So ReFi is how do we regenerate those relationships, build more trust, and how do we regenerate our natural ecosystems? And I think if you break apart the principles of crypto from the beginning, this is actually a more positive aspect of what we say when we mean decentralization. So I think this is why the ReFi narrative is really cool. So in terms of then breaking apart, rather than just say, okay, we need to decentralize things, maybe some other ways to talk about that, or here's some examples. Developing alternative economics. So breaking from the extractive cycle. If we can start to talk about it in that language, I think that's also how we can help bring in more people into the space who don't really understand what we mean when we say decentralization. Similarly, I think this is the big one for the space, is moving away from this idea of building old systems with new tools and actually saying we're here to build really new systems. When we say that we're here to build new systems, what that really means is that we have no idea what that looks like, right? Like, we have to do a lot of pilots, experimentation, and really uncover what new systems look like. Building financial equity. So there's a lot of talk in the space around financial inclusion. I think that moving away from inclusion towards equity helps us understand we're not just including people into the old system, we're actually developing a more equitable system. So these are just general things that we can start to think about as we're going through this process of saying, how do we kind of distance ourselves from what's happened in the past and start to go in a direction that we think we're going to actually build this infrastructure for the future. So there's 8 principles that we came up with for a ReFi framework. You can find this on our blog also, and I'm also going to be asking your input for ones to add as well. So regenerative impact, so we talked about that. Or is it leading to regenerative relationships between people and environments? To me, this is much bigger than just talking about carbon credits. It's more considering the long-term implications of the systems that we're building. So real human impact. So a lot of crypto projects today, perhaps outside of people in this room, focus on investors and speculators, people within the space as their end users. There hasn't been a lot of projects that have really figured out how to reach audiences outside of that space. So real human impact is getting to that point. Similarly, but a little different, is real economic impact. So are people actually able to support themselves more by accessing these financial services? Are people who aren't already empowered in the system able to access economic benefit? And then access. So can non-crypto people, non-technical people, non-finance people access this without having to read a white paper and understand a lot of complex systems? And of course, these are guiding principles. It's not always going to be there right away. So disruptive capacity. So I think this gets to what you're sharing. I think to reframe that a little bit, it's about cutting out middlemen, right? Like people who are extracting value in the center. That's a huge principle of blockchain. Have we seen a lot of examples of that yet? I would say we have, only within like sort of a privileged community, not really outside of that community. So true decentralization, this is one of my favorite principles, because I think when we talk about decentralization in the space, usually what we mean is like a technical aspect of decentralization. But socially, a lot of people can't access these systems. They don't have the capital to participate. They don't have the time to learn how to participate. They don't have maybe even the computers or the right technology. So decentralization, I think, is a word that we really need to push a little bit further. Synergistic potential. So is it an open source project? Is it a walled garden? Is it trying to create something that can interact with a lot of other projects in the space? And then finally, is it considering sustainability and long-term impacts on the planet? So we did this workshop earlier this week, and people threw out a few more principles that I hadn't included yet. So I'm going to think about how to include these. Basically, circular design, cradle to cradle. Security, in terms of, can people trust that the system is going to be there and provide the functions that it says it does? A sense of ethics or common good. And is it coming from this like abundance perspective rather than a scarcity mindset? So yeah, curious if anyone wants to talk about the principles or, throw out anything there that they think should be included. Or perhaps like a project that you've seen that you think is embodying some of these frameworks. That can also be an example.
project called Eternals. Lucia, I think you spoke a moment ago. I think there's an emphasis on her project that has to do with inspiring or elevating participants' sense that they're doing something actually very useful. Maybe joy is closer to a sense of ethics and common good. That's clear. But yeah, this notion that it's not just about making money, that it has really elevated an awareness about what the project is actually doing.
Yeah, and what I like about that is there's an emphasis on building community around impact, which, yeah, I think is the next slide. So this gets to how do we shift our perspective about our work here? These are some ones that we crowdsourced, so feel free to look at them, and they'll be online later too. But one of the biggest things that I've learned in my own work over the past year in starting Resource is trying to create these like financial incentives and frameworks too early is very much limiting our ability to progress towards the goals and the principles that we say we're here to do. So how do we create more structures that allow us to innovate and experiment without saying that we have this whole system figured out, all you do is buy the token and you stake it and you support it, right? Like there's a big gap, I think, between getting to those systems where they're fully functioning infrastructure and where we are today, which really needs a lot more experimentation and pilots. So one of the ideas for that I think this work could evolve into is creating these sort of more like flexible funding and governance models that allows people to still participate and build DAOs and do projects, but not necessarily start to be beholden to these old ideas of incentives that are really the legacy system just with new tools. And then just to say a few things more that came out of this shift in perspective, slowing down. So there's a lot of movement in the space of like, fear of being left out and trying to replicate other projects that are doing really well. I think it's the most difficult thing is try to say like, how do we step out of that kind of a little bit toxic force and slow down and find out in our own projects how can we really start to apply some of these principles? And what I think is interesting about the ReFi space and community is the more we form community, the easier it is to do that because we're actually saying we're going to adhere to this style of development than others. If anyone wants to share related to shifts in perspectives or maybe even in their own work, how they've experienced this, which I think is now that we're in a bear market moment, easier to access. But yeah, curious if anyone has any thoughts on that front?
I've seen a number of NFT projects, and Bored Ape Club is one of them. It's kind of a new type of incentive that emerged in some NFT projects recently, and it's not financial in nature. It's that through the project, participating, being active, owning an NFT, you can actually build your own personal brand using the project. So it's maybe still kind of a bit of a selfish purpose, but it's when in line with the goals that the community is trying to reach as a whole. There's actually this alignment of incentives, I think, can be quite powerful because it makes those communities very well federated. And I think this is also a disruptive kind of incentive mechanism that those NFT projects have spurred recently.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay, so just to wrap some things up, some ideas for this. So again, flexible structures in our own projects, not overcommitting to the ideas that we have it all figured out and this is the perfect structure. Instead, how do we be more honest and transparent as we're building that we're testing these new ideas. We still want people to participate and perhaps participate in upside, but it's not going to look the same. And so I think the more we can support each other in that narrative, the more that we can actually get to furtherment of these decentralization principles. So that's that. My name is Ashley. Resource is my project, and that's my Twitter. So if you want to follow along with this work or future developments, you can follow along there. Thank you.